John and Marjorie Abbott were farmers in Wales, UK. John's farm had been handed down to him from his father. It had been in the family for generations. Sheep farming was in his blood, and there wasn't a farmer alive who knew it better than him. Marjorie had been drawn to the rural life as a young girl and studied dairy science at college before meeting John and moving on to his farm with him. Their farm consisted of 50 hectares spread across barren mountaintops, steep bracken-covered hillsides, rocky ravines and rolling countryside. It was a beautiful landscape to wake up to each morning, but the winters could be brutal. If there was snow in the UK, the Abbott's farm was sure to be covered. John and Marjorie spent many winter days and nights digging sheep out of snowdrifts, ploughing away through their fields and bringing their animals in from the biting cold. But farming wasn't just a job, it was a way of life, and Marjorie could think of nothing better. Every morning John would go out in the Land Rover or on the quad bike with his 4 dogs and check on the sheep. Looking out of the kitchen window, Marjorie could see her husband disappearing around the edge of the mountain, accompanied by his loyal sheepdogs. One day, Marjorie was walking down by the river in the valley when she came across something in the water. It was a large brown sack, and it was clearly full of something. As Marjorie walked nearer, she noticed it move. She knelt down and untied the top of the sack and then jumped. A little black nose poked out. When Marjorie opened the sack fully, she could see that it was full of puppies. There were 6 of them, and every single one except one was dead. It wasn't uncommon for people to throw puppies in the river when they had too many of them. It was a devastating sight, but somehow a little tri-colored puppy had survived. Marjorie lifted it up. It was soaking wet and shivering from the cold. She wrapped it up in her jacket and carried it back to the farm. It must have only been 5 or 6 weeks old and was tiny. Inside the farmhouse, Marjorie made a little bed for the puppy right next to the Aga. It was the warmest place in the entire house. She then heated some milk up on the stove and poured it into a little dish for the puppy. It just turned its head away and rested its chin on the bed. Marjorie knew that she had to get some liquid into the animal or it stood no chance. At this age, it should still be nursing from its mother. Marjorie sat up all night with the puppy, syringing small amounts of warm water and milk into its mouth. The following morning, the puppy looked perkier. It lifted its head off the bed and pricked its ears when John came walking in. John ruffled its fur, and the pup's eyes already seemed brighter. Every day, Marjorie fed the puppy, and it grew stronger. It wasn't long before it could venture outside into the big, wide world. It stayed close to Marjorie, barely a few inches from her feet. But it was a miracle to see how this small bundle of fur had already come such a long way. Marjorie named the puppy Flick because she would always flick her head around to see where Marjorie was. She was the only dog that was allowed into the farmhouse. The others all slept in their kennels outside. After a few months, John introduced Flick to the other sheepdogs on the farm. He took her on her first exploration of the fields. Instead of running alongside the quad bike like the other dogs, Flick insisted on sitting on the back, peering over John's shoulder. He wasn't sure if she would ever make a good sheepdog. When he set her down in front of the sheep, she cowered behind his big boots. She didn't seem to have the same instincts as the other dogs, but what Flick lacked working with the sheep, she made up for in her love and loyalty. One day, John and Marjorie would see just how loving and loyal she really was. One morning, when Flick was 4 years old, she jumped onto the back of the quad bike as usual. John climbed on, and the other dogs barked excitedly, racing around and around the bike until John started the engine. Then they all raced off along the track. Marjorie looked out the window and watched as John disappeared around the mountainside. It was a freezing cold morning. The lawn was white with frost. Icicles dangled from the leaky guttering, and a mist hung in the air as the sun's glow painted the landscape golden. Marjorie was busy inside the house, filling out paperwork and tax returns for the farm. She poured herself a cup of tea. The kettle was always on the Aga, hot water always at the ready. In an hour's time, John would come in through the door after his rounds, and they would have a cup of tea together and discuss the plans for the day. But that day was different. Marjorie thought she heard the dogs barking in the distance. This wasn't unusual if they were rounding up the sheep, but she knew John was just checking the stock today. She peered through the window but couldn't see anything, and so went back to her work. But unbeknown to Marjorie, up on the mountainside, disaster had struck. John had been driving along the steep track when he spotted a sheep on its back. This wasn't uncommon when their fleeces were so thick and heavy that they struggled to get up. John turned off from the track and drove up towards the sheep when the quad bike slipped on some ice. It only slid downwards a few feet, but the momentum it gained was enough to flip the quad bike when it hit a rut in the track below. Flick leapt off just in time, but John wasn't so lucky. He landed on the rock-hard ground, and less than a second later, the quad bike landed on top of him. He let out a yell as the bike crushed his hips. He tried to push it off him, but it was too heavy. He lay there for a few moments, out of breath and gasping pain. He could just about lift his head. He looked all around. There wasn't anyone in sight. The farmhouse was around the other side of the mountain. He didn't have a mobile phone back in those days, and there was no way of contacting Marjorie for help. John knew that his wife would eventually come looking for him, but that could be hours away. He had to try and stay alive until help came. But it was bitterly cold, and he was pressed into the frosty ground with no means of keeping warm. He didn't know if his hips were broken. The pain was almost unbearable. The dogs started getting restless. They began barking at him, the noise that Marjorie had heard back at the house. They weren't helping. A couple of them trotted off, sniffing the ground. But there was no sign of Flick. John assumed she had got spooked by the accident and run off, but he couldn't be further from the truth. Flick had indeed run off, but it wasn't because she was afraid. She had run back to the farmhouse to summon help. It was about a mile away, but she knew her way and followed the track along the side of the mountain. She leapt over the gate that John usually opened for them and raced across the lawn to the house. Then she pawed at the front door until Marjorie opened it. Marjorie was surprised to see the dog at the door. She knew immediately that something was wrong. She grabbed her coat and rushed out to the Land Rover. Flick refused to jump in beside her. Instead, she barked and began running back to the gate. Flick was clearly agitated. They followed the track along the side of the mountain, with Marjorie scouring the surrounds for any sign of John. Then she spotted him. Flick left the track and ran over to him, lying down by his side. The relief on John's face when Marjorie arrived said it all. He knew that he was going to be okay. Marjorie had to race back to the house to call for an ambulance, and both the paramedics and a neighboring farmer helped rescue John. He had suffered a fractured hip, but went on to make a full recovery thanks to the heroic efforts of Flick, the rescued pup.